Around 540 BCE, on a stretch of southwestern coastline that had not yet been given the name it would carry into history, a fleet of ships came in from the sea. The vessels were Phocasian, crewed by people who had left their home city on the Aegean coast of Asia Minor rather than submit to Persian rule, and they arrived carrying everything a displaced community carries: the practical necessities, the memories, the particular habits of speech and worship and argument that a people accumulates over generations. The coast they were approaching was unfamiliar. The water was the same water, salt and deep and indifferent to whoever crossed it, but the land rising from it was not theirs, not yet, and the act of making it theirs would take time of the kind that outlasts any single life. They came ashore and began to build. The city they founded on that southwestern strip of what is now called Campania, they named Elea, and it was neither grand nor obscure, a settlement of moderate size, practical in its arrangements, positioned at a certain remove from the larger centers of power and commerce that shaped the Greek world. Sybaris was to the south, Naples to the north, and between them Elea occupied a position that was neither central nor marginal, but simply its own, the way places sometimes are when they have come into being through the energy of displacement rather than the slow accretion of ordinary prosperity. The Phocians had been people of the sea. Their new city sat above that same sea, and the sound of it would have been continuous, low and old, a sound that preceded them and would continue long after. The land around the city was fertile enough to sustain it. The hills behind were quiet, and in the way that certain kinds of place seem almost to invite a particular kind of thought, not because landscape determines thinking, but because the absence of distraction allows it room. Elea would eventually produce something that no one standing on that beach in 540 BCE could have predicted. Within 2 generations of the founding, the city would become home to a philosophical tradition unlike anything the Greek world had yet seen. Not yet, for now there was only the work of building, the work of staying, the long patient labor of making a foreign coast into somewhere a life could be lived. It is worth sitting for a moment with the ordinariness of that beginning before any philosophy enters the picture. A group of people, frightened enough to cross an open sea rather than remain under foreign rule, putting walls up on unfamiliar ground, planting, trading, arguing about boundaries and governance in the ordinary human way. Nothing in their early decades at Elea distinguished them philosophically from dozens of other colonial settlements scattered across the Western Greek world. They were survivors, pragmatists, builders. The philosophical tradition that would make Elea famous came later, and it came not from the collective memory of the founding, but from a single mind, living in the city, perhaps a century and a half after those first ships came in, who looked at the world with a particular kind of patience and found in the looking something he had not expected to find. That mind belonged to Parmenides. His birth is placed by ancient sources at around 515 BCE, which would mean he was born into a city that had already been standing for a generation or more, already settled into its patterns and routines, already developing the quieter rhythms that follow the first urgent labor of founding. Diogenes Laertius, writing centuries later and working from sources of variable reliability, gives this date with the uncertain confidence of ancient biography: approximate, plausible, accepted for lack of better evidence. What matters less than the precision of the year is the quality of the period. The early 5th century BCE was a time of extraordinary intellectual activity across the Greek-speaking world. In the cities of Ionia, In the colonies of Italy and Sicily, in Athens itself, thinkers were asking questions about the nature of things that no official religion or inherited cosmology had been designed to answer. The philosophical project that Parmenides was born into had been underway for several generations already. It had begun in the tradition's own telling, with Thales of Miletus, who had looked at the world with unusual attention and concluded that water was the fundamental substance of all things, that behind the apparent variety of the natural world, behind stone and bone and air and fire, there was a single underlying principle from which everything arose and to which everything would return. This was not a mythological claim, though it is easy to misread it as one. Thales was not saying that a god of water had created the world. He was saying that the world, examined carefully and honestly, revealed itself to be, at its deepest level, a single kind of thing. The names we give to different things, the categories we use to sort experience, might be convenient and even accurate at the level of everyday life, but at the level of what things actually are, one principle runs through everything. After Thales, Anaximander had looked at water and found it too specific, too much like one of the things it was supposed to explain, and had proposed instead the hyperbron, the indefinite, the boundless, as the true ground of things. After Anaximander, Anaximenes had returned to the particular and named air, air in different degrees of density and rarefaction producing, through purely natural processes, everything from fire to stone. And in the same general period, on a different part of the Italian coastline, Pythagoras had gathered followers around the proposition that number was the underlying principle, not a substance but a structure, a mathematical order hidden beneath the apparent chaos of experience. Each of these thinkers was working the same basic problem from a different angle. Each was asking, what is the world really? When you strip away the surface, what remains when everything that seems contingent and variable and accidental is set aside? Parmenides was born into a world where this question was already in the air. He would have grown up hearing some version of it. He would have been aware that serious minds had been working on it for generations without arriving at an agreed answer. And at some point, the tradition does not record exactly when or what the occasion was. He sat down with the problem himself and found that the approach everyone had been taking was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in its details, while correct in its general orientation. Wrong in a way that required starting over from a position so far back that the previous answers, each of them, became symptoms of a confusion no one had clearly identified. What that confusion was, and what Parmenides found when he looked past it, is not the business of this first passage of the night. There is time for that, and it will come. For now, what matters is the landscape, the physical landscape of Elebolius and its coastline, and the intellectual landscape of a world already restless with foundational questions, because it is in that landscape that Parmenides lived his long life, and the shape of that life matters before any argument can be properly heard. He was understood by later tradition to have been genuinely distinguished, not merely as a thinker, but as a practical figure in Elebel's civic life. Plutarch and others mention his involvement in the legislation of the city, the suggestion being that he was not only a philosopher in the withdrawn or purely speculative sense, but a man who participated in the administration of the community, who took seriously the ordinary claims of civic responsibility, alongside the extraordinary claims of philosophical inquiry. This combination, while not unique in ancient Greek philosophy, is worth noticing. Parmenides was not a hermit. He was not removed from the life of the city in which he lived. He walked its streets, participated in its governance, and at the same time pursued a line of thought that would lead him to conclusions so radical, so demanding in their implications, that the world his fellow citizens moved through daily, the world of commerce and weather and political dispute, and the plain fact of things coming into being and passing away, that world would turn out, on his account, to be something quite other than what it appeared to be. The ancient world preserved a sense of Parmenides as a figure of unusual gravity. Not cold, not severe, the tradition does not paint him as a difficult man in temperament, but serious in the specific way that a person becomes serious when they have spent enough time with a genuinely hard question that the urgency has dropped away and only the depth remains. He was the kind of thinker who made other thinkers feel, in his presence, that they had been moving too quickly, that the questions they thought they had passed through deserved a longer stay. Plato gives us a portrait that, whatever its historical accuracy, captures something of what later generations felt Parmenides represented. In the dialogue that bears his name, Plato imagines a meeting between a very old Parmenides and a young Socrates, set in Athens around 450 BCE. The philosopher from Elebal is elderly, white-haired, distinguished, described with a kind of reverence that Plato extends to very few figures in his dialogues, and that sits noticeably differently from the way he handles even those thinkers he greatly admires. Whether or not Socrates and Parmenides ever actually occupied the same room in Athens, the encounter Plato imagines is philosophically plausible. Parmenides would have been in his 60s or 70s by 450 BCE, still intellectually active, still the kind of figure a young philosopher would feel the weight of. And Socrates, who would have been perhaps 20 years old at the time, young and confident and already in the habit of asking uncomfortable questions, meets in the Parmenides of that dialogue someone whose questions go deeper than his own, someone who has not merely asked whether a given belief is well-founded, but has asked whether the most basic categories everyone uses to think about anything are themselves coherent. The dialogue is the most technically demanding in the Platonic corpus. It moves through logical territory so difficult that even experienced readers find it dense and resistant. Plato was not a careless writer. He did not construct difficult texts by accident. The difficulty of the Parmenides reflects something true about the difficulty of the philosophical position it is grappling with. The sense that Parmenides had identified a problem lying so far beneath the usual level of philosophical discussion that even the tools one would normally use to examine it turn out to be part of the problem. Aristotle, who had no patience for obscurity and little tolerance for arguments he could not assess on their merits, took Parmenides seriously in a way that speaks to the genuine force of the position. He did not dismiss the Eleatic arguments as interesting, but antiquated. He engaged with them, pressed against them, found their weaknesses, proposed counter-arguments, in a way that suggests he understood that the problems Parmenides raised did not simply disappear if you pointed out that your feet do appear to be moving when you walk across the room. The arguments were more careful than that. They required more careful responses. And the fact that Aristotle felt obliged to provide such responses, rather than simply pointing at the obvious experience of motion and plurality and considering the matter closed, tells us something about the quality of the challenge Parmenides had posed. Between Aristotle and Plato, between the technical density of the dialogue and the sustained engagement of the physics and the metaphysics, Parmenides becomes not merely a historical figure, but something like an unavoidable presence in ancient Greek thought, a thinker whose conclusions any serious philosopher was obliged to confront directly, whether to defend them or to find, if they could, a way around them. This is a particular kind of philosophical legacy, Many thinkers are important because they are interesting, because they open new questions or proposed new approaches. Parmenides is important because his argument is extremely difficult to dismiss without doing real philosophical work, and everyone who attempted to dismiss it discovered in the attempt that the work required was harder than they had expected. His student Zeno shared his city and his commitment to a rigorous philosophical method. The relationship between them was close enough that Plato's dialogue presents them traveling to Athens together. Zeno, as the younger man, devoted to his teacher, carrying with him a written work of his own that he had composed not as an independent philosophical statement, but as a defense of Parmenides, a set of arguments designed to show that the ordinary view of the world, the view that takes plurality and motion as simply and obviously real, generates contradictions that it cannot resolve on its own terms. Zeno's method was different from Parmenides, where Parmenides had moved forward from foundational premises toward necessary conclusions. Zeno moved in the opposite direction, taking the common sense view and demonstrating, step by careful step, that it could not hold its own weight. But the two methods served the same end. Both Parmenides and Zeno believed that what ordinary experience presents as obvious is, when examined carefully, deeply problematic, and that a mind willing to follow the argument wherever it leads would find itself somewhere other than where it started. Melissus of Samos, the third major figure associated with the Eleatic tradition, extended Parmenides's conclusions in somewhat different directions, arguing, among other things, that being was spatially infinite rather than bounded, as Parmenides had suggested, but the core commitment to monism, to the fundamental oneness and unchangingness of reality, remained. The school, if it can be called that, was held together not by institutional structure, but by a shared philosophical orientation, the conviction that what is most real is radically different from what sensory experience presents, and that the path to understanding what is most real runs through argument rather than through observation. Elodie itself was not a major center of the ancient world. It was not Athens where the great debates of the 5th and 4th centuries BEE would eventually be conducted. It was not Miletus where the philosophical tradition had first found its footing. It was a colonial city of moderate size, sitting between cultures, between the Greek world and the indigenous populations of southern Italy, neither fully embedded in one nor isolated from the other. There is something in this marginal position that may be relevant, though the connection should not be pushed too hard. The philosophers who emerged from Elis were not building on a rich local intellectual tradition. They were, in a certain sense, thinking in a space that had not already been claimed, thinking in a place where the usual assumptions of the larger Greek world arrived, if they arrived at all, with some of the stridency worn off, where a particular kind of rigorous abstract thought could develop without constant reference to established authority. The Phocian founders who built that city on the southwestern coast would not have known they were founding a place that philosophy would eventually need. They were trying to survive. They were putting walls up and roofs on and organizing the distribution of resources in the practical way that a displaced community organizes itself when it understands that no one is coming to help it. The philosophical tradition that their city would eventually produce was not a consequence of any intention they had. It was what grew, over several generations, in the particular soil they had made, by arriving where they arrived, bringing what they brought, and staying. There is a long passage between the founding of a city and the flowering of a philosophical tradition within it. Those generations are mostly silent, in the sense that history does not record them in detail. Elida, during the decades between its founding and Parmenides's birth, was simply living, trading, building, governing itself, participating in the networks of commerce and kinship that connected the Greek colonies of the West. The philosophical work that would make it famous was still generations away, accumulating in no visible form, forming in the way that things form when there is no name yet for what they will be. By the time Parmenides was old enough to think seriously about the problems that would occupy the rest of his life, the pre-Socratic tradition had been underway for the better part of a century. Thales had declared water the principle of things. Anaximander had proposed the indefinite. Anaximenes had returned to a particular substance and named air. Pythagoras had gathered his community around the claim that number underlies all things. Heraclitus had argued, somewhere across the water in Ephesus, that flux was the fundamental condition of reality, that the world was not a collection of stable things, but a process of perpetual becoming, held together by a hidden logos that most people were too inattentive to perceive. The landscape of foundational questions was already deeply worked by the time Parmenides entered it. What he brought was not a new answer to the question of which substance underlies everything. He brought something more disruptive than that. He brought a method, a commitment to following logical argument, wherever it led, regardless of what it required him to say about the world of ordinary experience. And he brought a question that the others had not quite managed to ask. Not what the world is made of, but what it means for anything to be at all. The question of being itself, prior to any particular account of what beings there are, is the question Parmenides arrived at, and the conclusions he drew from that question were conclusions that the world he was living in was not prepared for, and that the philosophical tradition that came after him would spend several centuries trying to absorb. He was, by the time his philosophical work was complete, a very old man. The ancient sources suggest that he lived a long life, long enough to travel to Athens if the encounter Plato describes has any historical basis, long enough to see his student Zeno carry the Eleatic arguments into new territory, long enough to have outlasted the urgency of the initial philosophical discovery and arrived at the kind of settled relationship with a question that only very long engagement with it produces. He was not, in his old age, still pressing forward, still trying to work something out. He had worked it out, or as much of it as he believed could be worked out, and the years that followed were the years of a man who had lived long enough with his conclusions to have made them genuinely his own. There is something in that image, the old man, the city above the sea, the long life given to a single question, that belongs to a particular tradition of philosophical vocation. It is not the vocation of the scholar who moves from problem to problem as curiosity directs, picking up one question and setting it down for another. It is the vocation of the philosopher who finds early enough the question that is worth a life, and then gives the life to it without reservation, following the argument wherever it leads, continuing to sit with what the argument has produced, even when what it has produced is strange, or uncomfortable, or deeply at odds with what everyone around him takes to be obviously true. Parmenides did not recant. There is no tradition of a late reversal, no suggestion that in old age he softened his conclusions or found a way to reconcile them with the ordinary experience of change and plurality that he had, in his philosophical work, so thoroughly examined. The tradition preserves him as a figure of consistency, a thinker who had arrived at what the argument required and stayed there, not from stubbornness or incapacity for revision, but from the deep philosophical conviction that what the argument required was what was true, and that the apparent conflict between the argument's conclusions and the daily experience of a world in motion was a conflict the experience would eventually have to lose. The sea outside Ella continued to move, as it always had, the waves arriving and retreating, the surface never the same from moment to moment, the restlessness of water doing what water does. And inside the city, in the later decades of the 5th century BCE, an old man who had spent his life thinking about what it means for anything to be at all, sat with that question in the particular calm that follows not the resolution of a question, but the long, patient recognition that the question has shown everything it is going to show, and that what it has shown is enough, and that what remains is simply to rest in what has been found, without urgency, without further demand, in the stillness that the thinking, done fully and honestly, always eventually makes. The ships that had built this city arrived on a coastline that had no name for what it was about to become. The people who came off those ships were tired and displaced and carrying everything they could carry. Within a few generations, in the city they built on that unfamiliar ground, a single mind would look at the world with unusual patience and arrive at conclusions that the larger philosophical world would find itself unable to ignore. And that mind would be old, eventually, and still, in the way that a mind becomes still, not from inactivity, but from having followed a question all the way to where it was going, and having found, in that place, something that required no further movement. The wheels sang in their axle boxes as the chariot moved forward. That is the first sound in the poem, not an argument, not a declaration, not a claim about the nature of reality. The sound of wheels singing, of something being carried forward through the dark at a speed the body alone could never reach. The mares that drew the chariot were immortal. The road they traveled passed between the gates of night and day. The daughters of the sun rode ahead, having left the house of night behind them, and the veils had been pushed back from their heads so that the light, if there was light on this road, could reach them. The philosopher rode inside all of this, carried rather than walking, moved by something other than his own intention, approaching a threshold he had not built and could not have found alone. This is where the poem begins. Not in a city, not in a conversation, not in the methodical unfolding of an argument, but in motion, in the specific sensation of being carried, of watching the dark open ahead, of hearing the bronze gates groan as justice unlocked them and the road continued on the other side. Parmenides wrote in hexameter verse the same long breathing lines that Homer had used for ships and wars and gods returning in disguise to the houses of the people who needed them. The same lines Hesiod had used to describe the birth of the world out of chaos, the emergence of the gods, the ages of the earth passing from gold down through silver and bronze to the iron present in which ordinary human beings find themselves. Hexameter was the meter of authoritative utterance, the rhythm in which the Greeks had learned to receive the most serious things the tradition had to offer. When Parmenides chose it, he was choosing a container already heavy with that inheritance. Every philosophical claim he placed inside those lines arrived pre-freighted with the weight of everything the tradition had already said in the same form, and then, inside that container carrying all that gravity, he said something the tradition had never said before. The lines themselves enforce a particular quality of attention. Hexameter is not a meter one rushes through. Its long syllables and its patterns of rising and falling stress require a kind of patient following, a willingness to let the line move at its own pace, to wait for the thought to complete itself at the end, rather than reaching ahead to grasp it early. A listener in the ancient world hearing the poem aloud would have felt the argument arriving through the rhythm before the individual words had fully assembled into meaning. The sound would have been working on the body, while the sense was still forming in the mind. This was not incidental to what Parmenides was doing. The form was part of the philosophy. The slowness was part of the argument. Three broad movements run through the poem as it has come down to us. The first is the proem, the poem's opening, the chariot journey, the arrival at the goddess, the promise of what is to follow. The second is the way of truth, the asterisk aletheia asterisk, where the argument about being unfolds in its full clarity and necessity. The third is the way of opinion, the asterisk doxa asterisk, where Parmenides describes the world of ordinary appearance, not to endorse it, but to show how it is built, and where its foundations give way. These three movements together make up the philosophical architecture of the whole. But what has survived is not the whole. What has survived is approximately 160 lines of verse, preserved almost entirely in the pages of later writers who quoted the poem to argue with it, or to use it as evidence, or sometimes, in the case of one late ancient commentator named Simplicius, simply because they understood that without the transcription, the words would not last. Simplicius wrote in the 6th century of the Common Era, more than 1,000 years after Parmenides had composed the poem, on the southwestern coast of what is now Italy. He was a Neoplatonist, a careful scholar, a man who worked in a tradition that had been reading and rereading the Greek philosophical inheritance for centuries. He quoted long passages of the way of truth, not because he was making a direct argument about Parmenides in that particular moment, but because, as he says himself, the original text had become so rare that he was not confident future readers would have access to it. He was right to be uncertain. The physical copy he was quoting from has long since ceased to exist. What remains is the quotation, preserved inside Simplicius's commentary on a different work by Aristotle, which itself survived through the fragile chain of Byzantine manuscript copying and eventually into print. The poem is there now because someone, more than 10 centuries after it was written, decided it was too important to summarize rather than reproduce. That decision, made in a 6th century library, is one of the reasons these lines can still be read at all. The proem announces itself as a journey, but it has the emotional texture of an arrival. The philosopher has been transported, has come from somewhere behind him to somewhere ahead, has passed through locked gates, and emerged on a road lit differently from the ordinary world. The goddess who meets him is unnamed in the surviving text. Scholars have identified her with justice, with necessity, with a figure related to the goddesses of night, who appear in other ancient sources. What matters in the poem is not which deity she is, but what she does and how she does it. She does not argue from authority. She does not appeal to tradition. She does not say, "Receive this teaching because I am divine and you are not, or because others before you have believed it." She says, in effect, follow the argument wherever it leads. The only ground for what she will tell him is the argument itself. She is the voice of reason personified, not the voice of reasonable opinion, not the voice of what most people believe, but the voice of what must be true, because its negation cannot hold together. Her greeting is warm. Among translations of the opening of the proem, there is something in the original that reads as genuine welcome, the philosopher arriving after the journey and finding himself received, not tested, not interrogated, but met. She tells him that it is not ill fate that has sent him on this road. It is right, she says, in justice. He has come to where he should be, and now she will tell him everything, both the unshaken heart of well-rounded truth and the opinions of mortals in which there is no true reliance. Both things. Not just the bright, clear thing, but also the other thing, the more human thing, the thing that fills ordinary experience and cannot quite sustain the scrutiny she is about to bring to bear on it. She holds out both paths from the beginning. The philosopher standing at the threshold, freshly arrived, can already see both roads from where he stands. The hexameter line, as a philosophical container, is worth sitting with for a moment. Prose allows an argument to breathe and expand, to qualify itself, to acknowledge complexity and return to it, to move at whatever pace the difficulty requires. Verse does not allow this. Verse requires compression. Every claim must fit within the line, must submit to the formal pressure of the meter, must accept the discipline of a structure that was not designed for philosophical argument and does not relax its requirements simply because the argument is difficult. What this compression does is concentrate each claim to a density that prose would soften. The logical steps arrive close together, each one pressed against the next, each one given the formal weight of the meter, so that they feel necessary in a way that goes beyond what the syntax alone is producing. The constraint becomes a kind of proof by form, as though the fact that the argument fits into the line at all, that it can survive the pressure of the meter without fracturing, is its own kind of evidence that the argument holds. There is something in the poetic form that reaches the listener differently from the way an abstract argument reaches them. Scholars who have worked closely with the proem have observed that its imagery does not function purely as decoration, layered over a philosophical point that could have been expressed equally well in another form. The chariot, the mares, the daughters of the sun, the gates, the road through the dark, these are not illustrations of the philosophical content. They are the first instance of it. The journey the philosopher takes in the proem is a version of the same movement the argument then makes in the way of truth, a passage from the ordinary, multiform, changeable surface of things towards something underneath that is single, still, and complete. The poem enacts its own argument before it states it. By the time the goddess begins to lay out the logic of being, the listener has already felt, in the body, in the rhythm of the verse, in the image of being carried through the dark toward a threshold, something of what the argument is reaching for. Around 500 years after Parmenides composed the poem, Sextus Empiricus quoted sections of it in a work concerned with the nature of knowledge and the limits of what could be claimed with certainty. Sextus was a skeptic in the precise ancient sense, a member of a tradition that had concluded, after generations of inquiry, that no claim about the nature of reality could be firmly established, hence, and that the appropriate response to this situation was a suspension of judgment, followed by a kind of practical equanimity. He quoted Parmenides not to endorse him, but to examine him, to see where the arguments rested and where they could be pressed. The sections he preserved are sections that later scholars have been able to use alongside those from Simplicius and from Proclus, another Neoplatonist, to construct working versions of the text. Every modern edition of the poem is a reconstruction built on passages scattered through the works of writers who came centuries, sometimes a millennium after the original. There are gaps. There are places where the sequence of arguments is uncertain, where scholars argue about which fragment follows which, where a line that looks continuous may in fact be two pieces of different sections placed together by a later hand that was doing its best. The poem that exists now is the poem as it has been recovered from its readers, and every recovery involves interpretation, which means the text has always been, in some sense, already commented upon. This is not a complaint about the condition of ancient scholarship. It is simply the nature of this particular philosophical tradition. The poem that Parmenides composed was already a kind of recovery, a recovery of something the tradition around him had not fully grasped, or had grasped and then covered over with the noise of cosmological speculation and the confidence of the senses. The text that now exists is a recovery of a recovery, something that was found by later readers in the act of reading, preserved in the act of arguing with it, passed down in the form of someone else's commentary, and then recovered again by scholars who came to the commentary knowing that what they were looking for was beneath it. Proclus quotes the proem in the 5th century of the Common Era while discussing the nature of mathematical objects and whether they belong to the realm of pure intellect or occupy some intermediate position. The reason he turns to Parmenides is not that Parmenides said anything about mathematics. The reason is that the question of what kind of existence abstract objects have, whether they are truly real in the way that sensory objects are real, more real than sensory objects, or simply useful fictions, points back inevitably toward the question Parmenides had asked. What does it mean for something to be? Before one can say whether numbers exist, one must have some account of existence. Proclus understood that Parmenides had given the most radical and rigorous account of existence in the tradition, and that no later discussion of the reality of abstract objects could proceed without taking that account into consideration. The poem was still exerting pressure on philosophical argument 1,500 years after it was written, not because it had been preserved as a monument, but because the question it asked had not been set aside. The goddess in the proem speaks with the authority of necessity. This is important to be clear about. She does not speak with the authority of divine revelation in the way that a god in Homer speaks, delivering information from a level of reality to which human beings lack access, telling Achilles what the fates have decreed, or telling Odysseus which direction to sail. Her authority is different from this. Her authority is the authority of the argument itself. What she tells the philosopher he will be able to verify for himself by following the reasoning she offers. She is not asking for faith, she is promising demonstration. The difference between this and every earlier use of the authoritative divine voice in Greek literature is very large. The tradition of hexameter utterance had always relied, at least partly, on the speaker's relation to a source of knowledge beyond ordinary human reach, the muse, the god, the vision. Parmenides takes the form and transforms the source. The knowledge comes not from beyond reason, but from within it, not from a vision that the philosopher received, but from a logic that he can reconstruct step by step in his own mind, following each move as it is made. The goddess is the voice of argument, giving itself the authority that argument alone can claim. The mares in the proem are described as immortal, and they know the way. They are not guided. They carry the philosopher forward along a road they already know, and the daughters of the sun are escorts rather than navigators. They go ahead, they illuminate the path, but the path is already there. The gates between night and day are locked, and justice holds the keys, and she can be persuaded to open them. There is something in this imagery about the conditions under which certain kinds of understanding become available. The road does not open to everyone at every moment. It opens when approached correctly, when the right questions have been prepared, when the mind is in a condition to follow where the argument leads without flinching. The chariot journey is a preparation for receiving what the goddess will say. The listener of the poem is being placed in the same condition as the philosopher on the chariot, carried forward at a pace not of their own choosing, approaching something they have not built, about to hear something that will require a particular quality of attention. The daughters of the sun are named in the proem. In the Greek they are the Heliades, the daughters of Helios. They push back the veils from their heads as they leave the house of night. The detail is small and specific, in the way that true details are small and specific, not placed there to be symbolic, or rather placed there to be something more precise than symbolic, to be the kind of concrete image that carries a weight of meaning without quite announcing what that weight consists of. They are moving from dark to light. They are uncovering their faces as they move. The philosopher is with them, moving in the same direction, being carried by mares who know the road. Whatever threshold they are approaching together, they are approaching it with open faces, in the company of those who belong to the light, on a road that justice has agreed to open. The sound of the axle singing in the wheelbox is described with a word in the Greek that scholars have found particularly striking. The word suggests a high whistling or whirring sound, a sound produced by friction, by the pressure of the spinning wheel against the socket that holds it. It is a sound produced by the contact between two things moving in relation to each other, the wheel turning and the axle bearing its weight. For a poem that will go on to argue that motion is ultimately illusory, that what is most real is completely still, it is a vivid and exactly placed detail, the poem beginning in motion, in the physical sensation of being carried fast through the dark, before the goddess speaks, the first word that will begin to dismantle the ordinary world of change and appearance in which the chariot ride itself belongs. The motion is the starting point. Where it leads is stillness. But the poem knows the order of things. It begins where the listener is. What survives of the poem is roughly 160 lines. Scholars disagree about the original length. Some argue it was never much longer than what we have, that the surviving fragments represent most of the text. Others argue that what has been preserved is a fraction of a longer work, that entire sections of the Way of Opinion have been lost, that the cosmological account of which we now have only pieces was once fully developed. The disagreement is not resolvable from the evidence that exists. The poem as it stands has gaps and uncertain seams. There are places where the argument is interrupted and does not visibly resume, where the fragments move from one subject to another without the transition that would explain the connection. Reading the reconstruction is a little like reading a palimpsest, a text in which one layer has been partially erased and another written over it, so that at any moment one is reading through two documents at once, the original and the act of its preservation. The poem is what it is because people cared enough to copy it down inside works that served very different purposes, and what we have of it is exactly as much as their care extended to. The tripartite structure of the poem, proem, way of truth, way of opinion, is a scholarly convention, a way of organizing the fragments that reflects the logical structure of the philosophical argument. The proem sets the scene. The way of truth delivers the argument about being. The way of opinion describes the mortal account of the world and shows where it breaks down. This division is clean and useful and probably does reflect something genuine about how the poem was organized. But it can also give a false impression of how the poem was experienced in the ancient world. A listener hearing the poem read aloud would not have experienced three discrete sections separated by conceptual walls. They would have experienced a continuous unfolding, a single long movement from the chariot ride to the final cosmological account, with the argument and the imagery and the hexameter verse all working together throughout, none of them separable from the others in the way that a summary later can make them seem. The divisions are doors built by scholarship into a house that was originally designed without them. The tradition of authoritative poetic utterance that hexameter represented when Parmenides chose it was already ancient by his time. Homer was not datable with certainty, but the poems that bore his name were old enough that their origins were already obscure. Hesiod was somewhat closer, but still removed from the 5th century by centuries of distance. When Parmenides wrote in hexameter, he was writing in a form that the culture had been using for longer than any individual could remember, a form associated not with personal expression, but with the transmission of knowledge that mattered, that the tradition was responsible for preserving and passing on. To choose this form for a philosophical argument was to make a claim about the kind of thing the argument was, not an opinion, not a contribution to an ongoing debate, but something the tradition needed to receive and keep, something with the weight of the cosmological and theological knowledge that Homer and Hesiod had put into the same vessel. And then inside that vessel, inside all that authority, the content is an argument that dismantles almost everything that Homer and Hesiod and the tradition they represented had assumed. The form says, this is the kind of thing you need to remember. The content says almost everything you have been told to remember is not what it appeared to be. There is a particular quality to the kind of attention the poem asks for that is different from the attention that prose argument requires. Prose moves forward and can be followed forward, sentence by sentence, clause by clause, the argument building by visible steps toward a conclusion. Verse requires a different kind of following. The meter makes demands on something other than the analytical mind. The long syllables, the rising and falling of the rhythm, the way the line ends before the thought, always quite finishes and then continues in the next line. All of this requires the listener to be present in a way that does not fully separate comprehension from sensation. One understands the hexameter by moving with it as well as by parsing it. The argument arrives in the body as well as in the mind. Scholars who have written about the contemplative dimension of the poem, and there are several who have written about little else, have argued that this was part of Parmenides' intention, that the poem was designed to induce a state of absorption, a quality of sustained attention that was not simply intellectual concentration, but something that reached further in, something quieter and more complete, something closer to what the way of truth would describe than to the busy naming dividing attention of ordinary experience. The promise the goddess makes at the opening of the way of truth is that she will show the philosopher the unshaken heart of well-rounded truth. The phrase is striking. The truth has a shape, a center, a quality of being completely itself without remainder. It does not list or tilt. It does not have a side that is fuller than another side. It is rounded, which is to say, it is equally itself in every direction, equally present everywhere within itself, without an edge that leads somewhere else. The image is of completeness, not completeness as the accumulation of all possible things, but completeness as the condition of something that lacks nothing, that is not oriented toward anything beyond itself, that has nowhere to go because there is nowhere it needs to be. The truth is its own shape, and the philosopher is being carried toward its center. Alongside this promise, she makes another. She will also show the opinions of mortals, in which there is no true reliance. She holds out both paths, both accounts, the one that holds and the one that does not hold, and she names them side by side, without apology or transition. This is generous and also demanding. It would be easier to offer only the truth and dismiss the other thing in a single gesture. Instead, she offers the full account. Here is what is, and here also is what appears to be, laid out with the same care, the same formal attention, the same hexameter lines that carry everything else. The way of opinion will be detailed and sophisticated. The cosmology of fire and night will be worked out with real philosophical precision. It will be a genuinely careful description of how the world looks when approached through the senses and the naming habits of ordinary human beings. And all of that careful description will rest on a foundation that the way of truth has already shown cannot hold. But standing at the threshold, with the journey just completed, and the gates just opened, and the goddess just speaking for the first time, none of that has yet been shown. The philosopher stands at the fork. Both paths are visible from where he stands. One leads forward into the still, rounded, self-complete truth that the goddess has described. The other leads into the world of ordinary appearance, the world of fire and night, and things that seem to be and seem to cease, the world in which the chariot ride itself took place, the world of wheels singing in their axle boxes, and veils pushed back from faces, and bronze gates groaning on their hinges. Both paths are real in the sense of being available. Both can be followed. The choice is not yet made, or perhaps more precisely, the argument that will make the choice unnecessary has not yet been delivered. The listener sits at the same threshold. The poem has brought him here through the image, through the sound of the chariot, through the daughters of the sun, and the locked gates, and the promise of the goddess. The argument has not yet begun. The two paths rest side by side in the dark, neither one chosen, both simply present, waiting the way all paths wait, patient with the stillness that belongs to everything that has not yet been moved. There is no urgency here. The threshold has been standing for a long time. The goddess has been waiting at this fork since before the philosophy began, which is to say, since before the words existed to describe where the fork leads. She holds both paths out, without insisting, without demanding a response, without requiring anything from the philosopher except that he arrived and is now present and is willing to hear what she has to say. The chariot has stopped. The mares are still. The daughters of the sun, who escorted the philosopher through the gates, have fallen back into their quiet. The poem waits. The fork waits. The two paths extend into the dark in different directions, both of them genuine, both of them requiring a quality of attention that is steady and patient and willing to follow without knowing in advance where the following leads. This is where Parmenides placed the beginning of serious thinking, not in the conclusion, not in the argument already made and settled, but here at the threshold, in the moment of standing before the two possibilities, and knowing that what follows from this point will not be a matter of preference or opinion, or the inherited weight of what the tradition has said before. What follows from this point is the argument. The argument has a shape, and the shape is complete, and it is waiting on the other side of the threshold, with the patience of something that is nowhere it needs to go. The goddess speaks, and before the words arrive, there are two roads. Not roads through hills or coastline, not roads worn by feet across centuries of use. What lies before the philosopher in that moment of arrival, carried still and attentive to the threshold between night and day, is something older than any path made by traveling, two possibilities, and the goddess holding them out the way. A hand holds two different kinds of knowing, one in each palm, waiting for the mind to understand what it is looking at before it is asked to choose. One road leads forward. One road, the goddess says, cannot be traveled at all, though mortals try. It is, she says, and cannot not be. That is one road. The other, it is not, and necessarily is not. Those two sentences contain the whole of what follows. Every argument Parmenides makes, every conclusion that falls out of the way of truth, every consequence that will take centuries of philosophers to trace to its edge, all of it is already folded inside those two short declarations. The work that remains is only the work of following them honestly, without flinching, to wherever they go. The second road collapses immediately, not because the goddess dismisses it with impatience or waves it away as beneath examination. It collapses because she looks at it directly and finds that it was never a road. To say that something is not is already to encounter a difficulty that goes all the way down. To think the thought that nothing is there requires a thinker, and the act of thinking it has already installed something where the nothing was supposed to be. The mind reaches out toward pure non-being, toward the absolute absence of anything at all, and finds, each time, that the reaching itself has made a thing of what was meant to be empty. The thought defeats itself in the very moment of its formation. What was supposed to be an object of inquiry turns out to have no surface the mind can grip, because the surface requires something to be there, and non-being, if it were real, would have nothing there at all. The second path dissolves, not because it leads somewhere forbidden, but because it leads on inspection nowhere, because there is nowhere it could go, and no way to take even one step along it without stepping out of it entirely and back onto the first. This is the argument at its foundation. Everything else is consequence. Non-being cannot be thought. It cannot be spoken. The goddess is careful here. She is not making a claim about the limits of imagination or the difficulties of concentration. She is saying something more precise, that thinking and speaking, by their nature, take objects, and non-being cannot be an object of anything, because to be an object of thought or speech is already to be, already to exist in some sense, already to have entered the domain of the first path, rather than the second. There is no coherent way to refer to nothing. Every reference is already a kind of existence. Every word, even the word nothing, points at something, points in this case at the very concept it was supposed to dissolve. Language folds back, thought folds back, and where they fold back from is the only place there is to be. So what follows when non-being has been ruled out in this way? What follows is everything. If non-being cannot be, then being has always been. There was never a moment before being, because a moment before being would have to be a moment in which being was not, and non-being, the goddess has already established, is not a possible condition. The first path does not merely say that something exists now. It says that something has always existed, not because of the long persistence of any particular thing, but because the absence of existence is not a coherent state. Being cannot have arisen out of non-being. It cannot have been brought into existence by any process or force, because any such process would have had to begin from a condition in which being was not yet there, and that condition has been closed off. There was no such condition. There could not have been. Where there is a process, there is already something undergoing it, and something undergoing a process is already, in that moment, a piece of being. The chain of causation that would have to lead back to an origin in nothing runs back forever and finds at every step that it cannot reach what it was looking for, because what it was looking for was never there to be found. Being was not born. It will not perish. These two conclusions arrive together, as they must, because the logic that closes off the beginning closes off the ending by exactly the same movement. If being cannot arise from non-being, then it cannot return to non-being either. The path that is not available in one direction is not available in the other. To perish would mean to pass from being into a condition of not being, and not being is not a condition. It is not a place things go. It is not an after-state waiting at the end of a long process of dissolution. It is nothing, genuinely nothing, which means it cannot receive anything, cannot hold anything, cannot be arrived at from anywhere. The thing that could make being come to an end would have to be a place for it to end into, and there is no such place. Time passes through being without eroding it, the way light passes through still water without displacing anything at the bottom. Here there is a particular kind of rest in the argument, not the rest of a resolved problem, not the satisfaction of a difficulty that has been squared away, something quieter than that, the rest of arriving at a condition that could not have been otherwise. Being was never going to begin, and it is never going to end, and this is not a fact about its extraordinary resilience or the stubborn persistence of whatever it is made of. It is a fact about the logical structure of existence itself, that non-being is not available as a starting point or a destination, that the only road that can actually be traveled is the one the goddess held out first, and that road, followed to its end, arrives here at something that was always already the case, that needed no moment of creation and will require no moment of cessation, that simply is, in a way that makes the word simply feel for once entirely accurate. In the long centuries before this argument, philosophers had been asking what the world was made of. Thales had said water, Anaximenes had said air, Pythagoras had said the underlying order was numerical, that the real structure of things was the structure of ratio and proportion and the relations between countable magnitudes. Each of these proposals had taken the question of origins seriously, had asked what thing was foundational, what substance or principle underlay the shifting surface of appearance, and provided the ground that everything else stood on. These were serious inquiries, carefully made, and the thinkers who made them were not naive about the difficulties involved. But the question Parmenides was asking was different in kind, not merely an ambition. He was not asking what being was made of. He was asking what it meant for anything to be at all. The others had been asking about content. He was asking about the condition of content's possibility. He was asking about the very fact of existence, and finding that the fact, examined closely, had a logical structure that nothing could escape and nothing could contradict. Being must also be whole. This is the third consequence, and it follows as directly as the first two. If non-being is not available as a state, then it is not available as a gap within being either. Anything that would divide being from itself, any internal boundary, any crack, any region of lesser density or partial presence, would have to be a region of non-being inserted between two portions of being. But non-being is not available. The region of nothing between two somethings cannot be. Where there would be a gap, there is still being. Where there would be a boundary, a line at which being ends and something else begins, there is still being, because the something else would have to be non-being, and non-being has no room to exist. Being is everywhere. Being is continuously, without interruption, without internal articulation into parts that are separated from one another by any medium of division. It does not come in pieces. It is not an arrangement of smaller things held together by something between them. It is seamless in the way that only something from which all seams have been ruled out could be seamless, not contingently seamless, not merely very well joined, but necessarily, logically, utterly continuous with itself. The poem gives this wholeness an image. Well-rounded, the goddess says, extended equally in all directions from its center, like a sphere whose surface is equidistant from the middle at every point. The sphere is not offered as a claim about the literal geometric shape of existence. It is an image that carries the argument rather than illustrating it, a way of making felt rather than merely stated what it means for something to be complete. A sphere has no preferred direction. It has no edge that points somewhere else, no face turned towards something beyond itself, no orientation that implies a beyond at all. It is equally itself everywhere. It is the shape of something that has nowhere left to go, not because it has been contained, but because the concept of outside does not apply to it. Being, the goddess is saying, is like this, not like this in every literal detail, but like this in the quality of its completeness, in the way the image carries the feeling of something that has fully arrived. Motion cannot belong to being. This is perhaps the most startling consequence, though the logic that arrives at it is by now familiar. For being to move, it would have to move from where it is into a place where it currently is not. But where it currently is not would have to be a region of non-being, and non-being is not available. There is no empty space waiting to receive it, no void that it could cross, no elsewhere into which it could travel. Motion requires a destination, and all destinations are within being, which means that the movement from one location to another would be movement within being rather than movement of being. Being itself does not move. What appears to move does so within the plenum of being, within the continuous fullness that has no gaps and no outside. And what that appearance amounts to is a question the way of opinion will try to answer in its own way. But the way of truth is clear. The thing that genuinely is has no direction to move in, no absence to move into, no change of state available to it. It rests. It does not rest in the way that an exhausted thing rests, having stopped after effort. It rests in the way that a mathematical truth rests, not because it is tired, but because the category of movement does not apply to it in the first place. There is a thought one might have here. It is not a counter-argument. It is more like a feeling of vertigo, brief and then passing, the sense that all of this must be wrong because the world is obviously full of motion and change and multiplicity, because things very clearly do begin and end and differ from one another and move through space and come into being and perish. The world the argument describes does not look like the world one wakes up in. The argument leads somewhere the senses have never been. But the argument does not ask about the senses. It does not begin with what the senses report. It begins with a question about the logical structure of being and non-being, and the senses have nothing to say about that question, not because sensory experience is contemptible, but because the question is not the kind of question that experience can answer. What would an experience of pure being look like? What would it feel like to perceive that non-being is not available as a state? These are not questions that have sensory answers. The argument proceeds entirely on its own terms, through logical necessity, and the fact that its conclusions conflict with sensory experience is, for Parmenides, a diagnosis of sensory experience rather than a refutation of the argument. The senses report a world of multiplicity and change. The argument establishes that multiplicity and change require non-being, and since non-being is not available, what the senses are reporting is not the structure of what genuinely is. The senses are looking at something real. Being is still there, underneath, but they are not reading it correctly. They are reporting back a picture of the world that has been generated by the way mortals name and divide what is actually continuous and whole. This is not a comforting thought in the ordinary sense of comfortable. It is not meant to be. It is the thought of a mind that has followed an argument to wherever it goes, without stopping to ask whether the destination is convenient. But there is a different kind of comfort in it. The comfort of arriving at a structure that holds. The arguments in the way of truth do not waver. They do not have loose threads. Each step follows from the last with the weight of necessity rather than the contingency of plausibility. And when the conclusions are assembled, being is eternal, undivided, motionless, complete. They do not feel like a list of surprising facts. They feel like a single recognition arrived at from several directions, all pointing at the same thing. What genuinely is this way. It could not be otherwise. The method Parmenides uses to get there is worth dwelling on, slowly. He does not look at the world and notice patterns. He does not measure or collect or compare instances. He does not appeal to the authority of tradition or the testimony of teachers, though the goddess in the poem has the quality of authority. He starts from a single premise, the impossibility of non-being, and moves forward by entailment alone, asking at each step what must follow if the premise holds. The structure is deductive in a way that had not been clearly articulated before, though later philosophers would formalize it and give it names. What Parmenides was doing was showing that a sufficiently precise thought, held carefully enough, could yield knowledge about reality that no amount of sensory observation could provide or refute, knowledge that was not about the surface of things, but about the conditions under which any surface was possible at all. He was doing this before Socrates had begun asking what virtue was. He was doing this before Plato had articulated the theory of forms. He was working in Elia with the tools of rigorous thought alone, and the building he was constructing from those tools has turned out to be sturdier than almost anything that came before it. Later philosophers would find this difficult to ignore. Plato would spend much of his most demanding work circling the problem of non-being that Parmenides had raised, trying to find a way to restore the intelligibility of change and multiplicity without accepting the chaos that Parmenides argued was all that sensory experience could deliver. Aristotle would engage the argument directly, seriously, and at length, finding that he could not dismiss it without engaging with its specific logical moves. The Stoics, the Neoplatonists, thinkers working in traditions that Parmenides could not have anticipated, all of them would find that the question he had raised remained open, that his argument against non-being was a permanent piece of furniture in the philosophical room that could not simply be moved out of the way when it was inconvenient. He had put something into the structure of Western thought that would not come out, not because he was authoritative, not because his poem was beautiful, but because the argument itself, once made, could not be unmade. It was there, it held, and the holding was not the holding of a tradition or an institution. It was the holding of a logical entailment that anyone who followed it carefully enough would arrive at in the same place. Being, the goddess says, is held between the limits of mighty bonds, and here the image is of something constrained, not by external force, but by the necessity of its own nature, held in place not by chains around it, but by the logical impossibility of anywhere else for it to be. The bonds are the argument itself. The argument is the completeness. The completeness is the stillness. None of these words are quite right on their own. Each one is pointing at the same thing from a slightly different angle, the way the sphere metaphor points at it from a spatial angle, and the eternity argument points at it from a temporal angle, and the indivisibility argument points at it from a structural angle. The thing being pointed at is the same in every case. There is only one thing. There is only ever one thing, and the one thing does not change. It would be easy to experience this as a diminishment, the vivid particularity of the world, the way a specific afternoon light falls on a specific surface, the way time feels different at different ages, the way distinct things are genuinely distinct from one another and genuinely interesting in their distinctness. All of that would seem, on a quick reading, to be swept away by an argument that reduces everything to a single undifferentiated, unchanging plenum. But this is not quite what the argument does, if followed carefully. The argument does not say that the appearances are nothing. The way of opinion exists. The appearances are something. What the argument says is that the appearances are not what they appear to be at the level of genuine being. The multiplicity is real as appearance. The changes are real as changes, but at the level of what genuinely is, below the level of how being looks when named and divided by mortal thought, there is something that is never changed and could not change, something that is equally present in every apparent thing, something that is not diminished by being seen through all these different forms at once. The appearances are like patterns on the surface of the sphere. The sphere does not become those patterns. The patterns do not exhaust the sphere, and what the sphere is has never been altered by what appears on its surface. The argument terminates, as the goddess said it would, in a state that the poem calls well-rounded truth, aletheia, unconcealment, the condition of being seen without the overlay of mortal naming. It is not the truth of a correct statement. It is the condition of an unobstructed relationship between the mind and what genuinely is. The word in Greek aletheia was later interpreted by Heidegger as meaning unconcealment, the removal of what covers, the bringing into the open of what was always there but had been obscured. Whether or not Parmenides meant exactly this, the image is useful. What the way of truth arrives at is not a new discovery. It is not something being was hiding that the argument has now found. It is something that was always the case, that was never anywhere other than exactly where it is, that did not need to be found because it was never lost. The philosopher arrives at it not by traveling somewhere new, but by stopping traveling, by ceasing to follow the appearances from one thing to the next, by letting the naming and dividing come to rest, by sitting still with what is still. Being has no center, it is oriented toward. It has no edge that marks where it ends and something else begins. It is equally itself at every point, which means there is no point from which it looks different, no position outside it from which it could be compared to something else, no perspective that has a better view of it than any other, because all perspectives are inside it, are made of it, are already the thing they are trying to look at. The philosopher looking for being is not separate from what is being looked for. The thought thinking about what genuinely is already a portion of what genuinely is. The inquiry does not stand outside its object, and this means the conclusion of the argument, when it arrives, does not feel like an acquisition. It feels like a recognition, a settling into something that was always the case, a resting in what has always been the ground, even when the attention was pointed elsewhere. Not long-lasting, not old, not persisting across time, with extraordinary endurance. The argument Parmenides makes is more precise than any of these. Being is not old in the way a mountain is old, having been here through many human lifetimes, and likely to continue. Being is not even old in the way the universe is old, having begun before any particular thing began, and continuing after any particular thing ends. Being is outside the dimension of time altogether, not because it transcends time in some mystical sense, but because time is itself a feature of the world of appearance, a feature of the world in which things change and succeed one another, and being, having no change and no succession within itself, has no time to be old in. It is not that being has been here a very long time. It is that the category of duration does not apply to it. What is fully complete, fully itself, fully present everywhere it is, has no before and no after. It has no story. It simply is. This is the kind of thought that, when held gently, rather than gripped, becomes less like an argument and more like a place to rest. There is no need to resolve it entirely tonight. There is no need to verify the deductions or trace every step of the logic back to its source. The argument has been standing for 25 centuries, without requiring anyone's particular effort to maintain it. The conclusions are there, already settled, already at rest, being as eternal, as undivided, as motionless, as complete as the still interior of a sphere that is equally full and equally present at every point. The philosopher who made this argument had already done the work long before tonight, in a city on the southwestern coast of Italy, in the early centuries of rigorous Greek thought, in a life given entirely to the question of what it means for anything to be at all. The answer, as he found it, is that being simply is. It has no alternative. It has no boundary. It has no moment when it was not. It has no moment when it will have passed away. What is most real has nowhere it needs to go. The well-rounded sphere rests in the mind, not as a geometric shape, but as an image of that completeness, equally present, equally still, equally itself at every point on its surface and at every depth beneath it, holding everything that is within what it is and not requiring any of it to move. The goddess, when she describes the mortals who wander, is not unkind about it. She does not mock them. She sees them going about their days with a kind of careful confidence, naming the things they pass, trusting the evidence of what they touch and see and hear, and she offers a precise word for what they are doing. She says they are two-headed, not foolish, not wicked, two-headed, holding contradictory things at once without noticing the contradiction, moving through a world of appearing and disappearing as though that movement were the most natural thing, as though there were no difficulty in the fact that what was here yesterday is gone today, and what is gone today may return tomorrow in a different shape, wearing a different name. The people she describes are recognizable. They wake in the morning and the light is different from the night before, and this seems right to them. This seems like the way of things. They watch a fire and see it consuming what it touches, and they name what feeds it and what it becomes. Wood, flame, ash, 3 names for 3 stages, as though naming the stages were the same as understanding the change. They watch water moving over stones and hear it called a river, the same river it was last season, though almost nothing in it is the same as it was. They find this ordinary. They find this comfortable. The goddess is noting something about that comfort, something she wants the philosopher to understand before he walks any further down the road. She is offering him. She is not asking him to leave those people behind. She is asking him to notice what they are doing, the precise logical shape of it, and to see whether, on examination, it holds together the way they believe it does. 2 heads, she says, one that believes a thing is, one that believes the same thing is not, both working at once, neither aware of the other, each generating its own conclusions and sending them forward into a life that never pauses long enough to find the contradiction at its center. There is a Greek word for the kind of knowing those mortals practice. The word is asterisk, doxa, asterisk. It does not mean stupidity, and it does not mean dishonesty, and for centuries this word has been translated as opinion, though the idea it carries is wider than that. It is the state of taking for real what only appears, of investing confidence in things that show themselves to the senses, without asking whether the showing goes all the way down. A person living inside asterisk doxa. Asterisk is not making an error in the ordinary sense. They are not adding numbers incorrectly or misremembering a name. They are, the goddess suggests, oriented toward the wrong layer of things. They are attending to the surface that shifts and shimmers and reorganizes itself moment by moment, and they are calling that surface reality, when the surface is precisely what reality is not. The other word sits at the far end of a long distance from asterisk doxa, asterisk. The word is asterisk, aletheia, asterisk, and it carries in its roots a negation, aletheia, the unhidden, the unconcealed, as though truth were not something added to the world, but something the world has been blocking, something that becomes available when the ordinary concealing is set aside. This word has been translated as truth, but truth in English often means something that can be verified, something you could check against other things you know, something that can be tested and confirmed. Asterisk. Aletheia, asterisk, is different in character. It is less about checking and confirming and more about a kind of direct exposure, the thing itself, stripped of its ordinary coverings, no longer hiding behind the names that have been given to it, no longer appearing and disappearing according to the logic of mortal time. The gap between asterisk doxa, asterisk, and asterisk aletheia, asterisk, is not, in Parmenides, a gap between the educated and the uneducated, between the careful observer and the careless one. Sharper observation of the surface world does not bring a person closer to asterisk aletheia asterisk. It deepens their investment in the surface. It makes asterisk doxa asterisk more detailed and more confident without changing its fundamental character. The move toward asterisk aletheia asterisk is not a move along the same road. It is a change of road entirely. It is the recognition that the senses, however carefully attended to, are pointing at a layer of things that will not, by their nature, give back what the goddess is offering to show. Consider what it would mean to set that down, not to denounce it, not to argue against it or prove it wrong or replace it with something better, simply to set it down the way a person coming in from a long walk sets down a bag they have been carrying so long they have stopped noticing its weight, and stands for a moment in the surprising lightness of not carrying it. The two-headed mortals are not wrong to find the world full and interesting and changeable. The goddess does not say the world they move through is nothing. She says it is not the thing they believe it is, not the solid, independently existing reality they have taken it for. And there is a difference between saying the world is nothing and saying the world is not quite what it looks like. The philosopher Parmenides understood that language was carrying much of the difficulty. It was not simply that people trusted their senses too much, though the goddess suggests they do. It was that the names they gave to things had quietly taken on an ontological weight they had never been asked to justify. When someone says fire, they are not just making a sound, they are pointing, and the pointing implies that fire is a distinct thing with its own boundaries and its own existence, that fire is something separate from what it was before it burned, and separate from what it will leave behind. The name carves the world at a joint, and after the name has been in use long enough, the joint starts to seem like a natural feature of the world rather than a feature of the naming. Night was the other primary principle Parmenides used in the cosmological account the goddess offers. Fire and night, light and dark, the two poles around which the mortal world arranges its appearances. The goddess lays out a sophisticated account of how these two principles interweave to generate the world that mortals believe they inhabit, the stars in their courses, the arrangements of the heavens, the structure of what appears to be physical reality. The account is careful. The account is genuinely detailed, not a sketch, but something close to a system, a cosmology built from these two principles that can account for a great deal of what the senses report. And then the goddess holds the whole account at arm's length and says, "This is what mortals believe, and now you have heard it laid out with some care. But it is built from a mistake that no amount of care can fix. The mistake is not in the details. The details are as well reasoned as any cosmology the pre-Socratic world produced. The mistake is at the foundation, The assumption that fire and night are genuinely two, that reality can be divided at all, that the names carve something real. Any cosmology that begins with plurality has already stepped off the path of truth, not because its observations are wrong, but because plurality itself, on the argument already made, cannot belong to what genuinely is. What genuinely is has no parts, admits no division, cannot be carved by any name into a fire side and a night side. A cosmology built on two principles is built on a foundation. The way of truth has already shown to be impossible, and so the whole structure, however impressive, however internally consistent, stands over emptiness. What is strange and worth sitting with is that Parmenides bothered to include it. He could have simply said, "The world of appearances is an error. Here is the truth. The poem is finished." He did not do that. He had the goddess lay out the mortal cosmology with genuine care, genuine engagement, as though it mattered that the listener understand the error from the inside, rather than simply being told it is an error. Some scholars have found in this a kind of philosophical generosity, the acknowledgement that the world of asterisk doxa, asterisk is not random chaos, not a fever dream, but a systematic and in its own way coherent response to what the senses offer. The mortals who built this understanding were doing something reasonable. They were following the evidence available to them. The evidence, it turns out, was not pointing at the layer of things that holds. There is another way to read the inclusion of the way of opinion, and it has occupied scholars who have spent years sitting with the surviving fragments. Perhaps the cosmology of fire and night is not simply an error to be discarded, but a second description of the same thing, being seen through the medium of mortal naming, the undivided plenum refracted by the habits of language into the appearance of plurality and change. On this reading, fire and night are not straightforwardly wrong, but differently right. Right about what appears, unable to reach what underlies the appearing, and yet not entirely severed from it either. The surface and the depth are not two separate worlds. The surface is the depth, seen from an angle that cannot quite see what it is seeing. This is not the only way scholars have read these passages, and it would be a mistake to present it as settled. What can be said with more confidence is that the careful, elaborate structure of what the goddess offers, two paths, a cosmology of appearances included within the larger philosophical work, suggests that dismissal was not the only intention. The way of opinion was worth preserving. It was worth having the goddess speak at length about what mortals believe, not to validate the belief, but to honor the seriousness of the inquiry that produced it, and perhaps to suggest that the world of asterisk doxa, asterisk for all its ontological limitations, is the world that philosophers begin inside and cannot simply step out of by an act of will. The act of naming is where much of this becomes most vivid. A person stands in front of a tree and says tree. They do this so quickly, so automatically, that the naming happens before any decision to name. The word arrives with the perception, inseparable from it, so that what the person experiences is not first a perception and then a naming, but a named perception, a tree-shaped thing called tree, given its category before it has been looked at carefully, its identity settled before it has been fully encountered. The name does not describe the thing after the fact. The name shapes the encounter from the beginning, and the shape the name gives is always partial, always a simplification, always an imposition of fixed boundary on something that looked at long enough starts to soften at its edges. Parmenides' thought is that the softening at the edges is not a failure of attention, but a feature of what the thing actually is, or rather, a revelation that the thing is not quite as thing-like as the name implies. The tree shades into the soil that holds it. The soil shades into the water moving through it. The water shades into the atmosphere. At no point, looked at carefully enough, is there a natural joint where the name tree should stop applying and some other name should begin. The name imposes the joint. The joint is a feature of naming, and the naming is a feature of mortal cognitive habits. And the mortal cognitive habits are, the goddess says, what the philosopher is now being invited to step back from. Not violently, not by renouncing them, but by holding them lightly enough to see through them. Holding a name lightly is a stranger experience than it might sound. A person who has spent their whole life moving through a world of solidly named things, fire and night, stone and sky, self and other, and who begins to notice that the names are doing more work than the things require of them, can find the noticing disorienting at first. The edges start to soften, the categories start to feel provisional. What was a world of distinct and separately existing things starts to feel more like a world of distinctions that thinking has imposed on something that does not, in itself, require those distinctions. This is not nothing. This is not a comfortable conclusion, and yet, on the other side of the disorientation, there is something the philosophical tradition has recognized again and again, a kind of relief, a kind of release, as though the work of holding all those distinctions firmly in place had been more tiring than anyone quite noticed while they were doing it. Let the cosmology of fire and night be a beautiful map, then, detailed, internally consistent, produced by careful minds attending seriously to what the senses report. It is not wrong in the way a calculation is wrong. It is limited in the way all maps are limited by the fact that a map is a representation, and representations are always made in a medium that is not the territory, and the territory at its deepest layer is not representable by any medium available to mortal naming. The map can be admired, the craft that went into it can be acknowledged, and then the map can be set down quietly without regret, because what the goddess is pointing toward is not another better map. It is the territory itself, which has no need of maps and never did. The two-headed mortals moving through their world of fire and night are not separate from the philosopher sitting with the goddess. They are the philosopher before the question was asked, or after the question is set aside, or in those hours of every life when the inquiry rests and the ordinary world reasserts its comfortable solidity and its confident names. Parmenides did not write as though the way of truth were easily inhabited, as though a person could simply decide to live permanently at the level of asterisk aletheia, asterisk, and walk away from asterisk doxa, asterisk, without looking back. He wrote as though the two ways were genuinely different, genuinely exclusive of each other, and that the movement between them, when it occurred, was the result of following an argument all the way to its conclusion, rather than stopping at the point where the conclusion became uncomfortable. What the argument asks at its most fundamental is whether change is real, not whether things appear to change. They do, and the goddess does not deny it. Not whether mortal life is organized around change. It is, around birth and growth and decay, and the turning of seasons, and the rising and setting of whatever it is that rises and sets in the heavens. The question is whether the change is real at the level of being, whether what genuinely and most fully is can be said to change, or whether what changes is always, in some sense, something that is not quite fully real in the first place. The fire that burns is real in the way appearances are real, vivid, present to the senses, organized enough to be named and tracked and predicted. But the fire that burns is not, in the Parmenidean account, real in the way being is real, because being is not the kind of thing that burns or brightens or goes dark. a 20th century reader of the fragments, a scholar in a quiet room, the surviving passages copied from Simplicius, spread across a desk, the late afternoon light shifting in the window, might find themselves pausing over this question, not as a technical philosophical problem, but as something that touches the ordinary texture of a day. How much of what gives the day its weight, its sense of significance and consequence, depends on the reality of change, on the belief that what is done cannot be undone, that what is lost is genuinely gone, that time moves in one direction and carries things with it. The Parmenidean thought is not that this is wrong to feel. It is that the feeling, however vivid, is oriented toward the layer of appearance rather than the layer of being, and that something else is available if the orientation shifts. The names begin to loosen. This happens slowly and not all at once, and not by any act of will, but by something closer to a gradual relaxation. The way the body releases during sleep, not because the person decides to relax, but because the conditions for holding have dissolved, and what remains is simply the ground, the weight, the quiet continuation of something that was always there underneath the holding. The names of things do not disappear. Fire is still fire, and night is still night, and the world is still organized into the shapes that mortal naming has given it. But the names are no longer sitting as heavily on the things they name. The distinction between fire and night, once felt as the most fundamental kind of difference, light against dark, warmth against cold, presence against absence, starts to feel like a distinction made at the surface of something that has no surface in the deep. The goddess is not offering this as a loss. She is offering it as what the philosopher came to hear. The mortals named their world carefully and built a cosmology from the names, and the cosmology is not to be despised. It is, in its way, a remarkable achievement, the attempt of minds working within the constraints of asterisk doxa, asterisk to make the appearances cohere. But there is another kind of coherence, the goddess says, and it does not require the appearances. It requires only the willingness to follow an argument to the place where the argument terminates, where the conclusions stop multiplying, and what remains is simply what is, without division, without change, without the movement from one named state to another that mortal life mistakes for the fundamental activity of reality. What would it mean to hold the cosmology of fire and night the way one holds a work of craft that no longer needs to be used, not discarded, not destroyed, but set aside with something like respect for the skill that made it? The philosophers who came after Parmenides would argue about this for centuries. Some would try to save the appearances, to find a way of reconciling the reality of change with the arguments the goddess had made. Some would accept the Parmenidean conclusion and follow it wherever it led. Some would find in the very impossibility of the Parmenidean world, being without motion, reality without change, a reason to look more carefully at what the word motion actually means, what the word change requires, whether the ordinary assumptions the mortals bring to these words are as unproblematic as they seem. The fragments of the way of opinion that survive are in some places so detailed that the cosmological account feels almost contradictory, not in its internal logic, but in the sheer care with which Parmenides rendered a world he had already philosophically dismissed. The rings of fire and night encircling each other, the goddess who steers the heavenly bodies, the mixing of fire and night that generates the phenomena of ordinary experience, these are not the gestures of someone who found the mortal world uninteresting. They are the work of someone who understood the mortal world well enough to describe it with precision, and who chose, after that description, to set it down. Setting it down is not the same as never having held it. A A person who has lived inside a name for a long time, inside the name river, inside the name fire, inside the name self, and who begins to notice the name as a name rather than a transparent window onto the thing, is not losing the thing. The river is still there. The fire is still burning. The self is still present to its own experience, still moving through its days, still finding some things heavy and others light. What has changed is not the world, but the angle from which the world is seen, slightly back from the confident surface of naming, slightly toward the layer where the names have not yet arrived, where what is most real is also most quiet, most continuous, most without the restless need to change into something other than what it is. This is the direction the goddess is pointing, not away from the world, not into some separate, philosophically pure region where change and plurality have been abolished, into the same world, but deeper, past the level where the names are doing their work, past the level where fire is fire and night is night, and the difference between them is felt as the most fundamental kind of difference there is. Deeper than that, to the layer where the question of how many things there are has not yet been asked, where the question of whether things change has not yet been posed, where what is simply is, the way water at the bottom of a very deep place is simply water, without history, without direction, without the kind of urgency that names give to things. The two-headed mortals will wake tomorrow, and the names will be there waiting, and the world will be full and changeable, and the cosmology of fire and night will organize it as it always has. This is not a failure. This is the life that the Way of Opinion describes, coherent, detailed, internally consistent, genuinely organized around something that has the shape of knowledge, even if it does not reach all the way to *Aletheia. The goddess did not dismiss it carelessly. She described it with care, and then she set it beside the other way, and left the philosopher standing between them. Between the two ways there is no middle ground. The goddess was clear about this. Either the names reach all the way to what genuinely is, or they do not. Either the world of fire and night is the fundamental layer of reality, or it is an elaborate and vivid surface above something that names cannot touch. These are not positions that can be held simultaneously, which is precisely the diagnosis the goddess offered at the beginning, the two-headed condition of the mortals who try. But there is something that can be done with the gap between the two ways that is neither inhabiting one nor inhabiting the other. The names can be held at a slight distance, not removed, not replaced, simply held with a lightness that acknowledges what they are: tools, instruments of navigation, ways of organizing what the senses offer into shapes that can be communicated and shared and used. Good tools, useful tools, tools that have allowed the construction of cosmologies and calendars and conversations and entire civilizations built on the confidence that fire and night are real and separate and nameable, but tools, and only tools, pointing at something they were not made to touch. The mortal cosmology will continue. The names will do their work. And somewhere underneath the names, the philosopher's argument runs like a current in deep water, not visible from the surface, not felt in the ordinary movements of daily life, but present in the way a depth is present, the way stillness is present underneath the motion that crosses it. The goddess named the two ways, and showed the philosopher where one of them dissolved. What he was left with was not absence. What he was left with was the way of truth, and whatever it is like to rest there, beneath the names, beneath the motion, beneath the two-headed busy certainty that the world is exactly as it appears. Names, when held lightly enough, begin to feel like what they always were. A hand opens, not because the person decided to open it, but because the holding became gentle enough that what was held simply rested there, no longer gripped, no longer needing to be kept in place. Fire and night are still the names for something. What they are names for is still present, still real in the way appearances are real, still organizing the visible world into its familiar shapes. The naming just sits a little differently on the thing now, less like a definition and more like a gesture towards something that the word can indicate but not contain. The cosmology of fire and night was built with great care. It was built by minds that were doing their best with what they had, following the evidence, naming the phenomena, constructing a framework that could hold the appearances together and give them a shape that felt like understanding. The framework is still there, intricate and detailed, like a model of the heavens built from the inside of the heavens, accurate to the level of the appearances it was designed to describe. And the level of the appearances is a real level. It is not nothing. It is just not, in the end, the deepest ground. Somewhere the names are loosening, not all at once, the way a hand opens during sleep, without decision, without effort, in response to nothing more urgent than the simple fact of rest. The cosmology of fire and night continues overhead. The stars do what the goddess described, moving in their courses, organizing the night into its familiar patterns. And somewhere beneath the motion, beneath the naming, beneath the two-headed busy confidence that the world is full of distinct and separately existing things, there is something that has not moved, is not moving, has never needed to move, because it is already everywhere that it could possibly be, equally present at every point, equally full, equally still. The names settle quietly. They do not need to be put down all at once, or by force, or by the kind of philosophical determination that would itself be a form of effort. They settle the way things settle when the holding eases, and the night comes on, and the careful distinctions between fire and darkness grow softer at their edges, and what remains is neither fire nor night, but the open, unhurried fact of something that does not require a name to be what it is. Zeno arrived in Athens carrying a scroll, and the scroll contained arguments that nobody had asked for and almost nobody wanted. He was young then, perhaps 30, the kind of young that still carries the teacher's way of thinking in its bones. And what he had written was not a philosophy of his own, but something more precise and more patient than that, a demonstration conducted in logic that the world as everyone assumed it to be could not quite hold together under examination. He sat down with the scroll in his hands and the arguments already finished, already settled in his own understanding, and he waited for the questions to begin. The arguments were paradoxes in the old sense of that word, not clever puzzles or exercises in wit, but conclusions that followed necessarily from ordinary assumptions and arrived somewhere no ordinary assumption had anticipated. He had not invented them to be difficult. He had found them in the act of following a thought all the way to where it wanted to go, which is rarer than it sounds, because most thinking stops a few steps short of where the argument would take it if it were allowed to continue on its own terms. Zeno had let his continue, and the place they arrived was stillness, not the stillness of something resting, but the stillness underneath motion itself, the stillness that motion had always been resting on, without anyone quite having looked there before. To begin with Achilles is to begin with the most vivid of the paradoxes, the one that stays in the mind, not because it is the most technically demanding, but because it reaches something felt. Achilles is swift. Among the heroes of the ancient world, he is the one defined by speed, the one who runs, who covers ground, who arrives before the moment has finished, turning toward him. And Zeno placed him on a track with a tortoise, which is to say, he placed the fastest against the slowest, and then asked the listener to follow the arithmetic carefully and say where the race ends. The tortoise is given a head start, 100 paces or 1,000. The distance does not alter the argument's structure. Achilles begins to run, and he covers the distance to where the tortoise started. This takes some time, and in that time, however short, the tortoise has moved. It has moved only a little, a fraction of the original gap, but it has moved. So now Achilles must cover that smaller distance. He covers it, but again, in the time it took to cover it, the tortoise has moved again, a smaller fraction still, barely perceptible, but present. There is always another gap. There is always another fractional distance that must be crossed before the crossing of the previous one can be counted as complete. The series does not end. The distances diminish, but they do not stop. And Achilles, who has covered every previous distance in the race, must cover each successive one before he can be said to have caught up, which means he is always still catching up, still one step away from the step that would close the gap entirely. This is not how running works. Everyone who has watched a race knows that faster runners overtake slower ones, that the arithmetic of speed operates in the world the way it is supposed to operate, that Achilles would win and win easily. Zeno knew this too. The paradox was not meant to cast doubt on what anyone could see. It was meant to find the crack between what anyone could see and what thinking could reach, and to hold that crack open long enough for something to come through it. What comes through is a question about completion, about what it would mean to finish an infinite series of tasks. The distances Achilles must cross are infinite in number, however small they become. To reach the tortoise, he must cross infinitely many of them, one after another, in order. And the question that the paradox is actually asking is whether that kind of completion is possible, whether a thing that has infinitely many steps can, in the ordinary sense of the word, be done. Later mathematics would find ways to describe the series as convergent, to show that an infinite sum of diminishing quantities can resolve to a finite number. And this is true and useful, but it does not quite answer what Zeno was asking. He was asking not whether the sum is finite, but whether the accomplishing of infinite tasks is something that happens in the world, whether Achilles, as he runs, is actually performing each crossing separately, or whether something else is going on that the arithmetic has not yet found words for. The mathematics closes the gap on the page. The philosophical question about what happens on the track remains, patient and open, in the way that genuine philosophical questions tend to remain. The arrow paradox turns in a different direction. An arrow is flying through the air. This much is given. This much seems entirely certain to anyone watching it. Leave the bow and cross the sky. But Zeno asked the listener to pause the flight at any single instant. Not a short interval, not a brief span, an instant in the precise sense, a moment of time that has no duration, no length, no internal span in which movement could occur. At that instant, the arrow is somewhere. It occupies a region of space, and the region it occupies is exactly the region it occupies. No larger, no smaller, perfectly fitted to the arrow's present position. An arrow that exactly fills the space it is in is not moving through that space. It is simply in it, the way any stationary thing is in the space it occupies. At this instant, the arrow is at rest. Now time is composed of instants. Whether one imagines time as a continuous flow, or as a succession of discrete moments, any account of time must pass through its instants, through the present, through the now, through the only time that ever actually is. And if at each instant the arrow is at rest, then across all of its instants, across everything that composes its flight, the arrow is at rest. The motion is nowhere to be found in the instants. The instants contain only the arrow in its position, stationary in the space it fills, carrying nothing that could be described as movement. And yet the arrow flies. There is something in this that deserves to be held quietly rather than solved quickly. The gap it opens is not between mathematical descriptions and physical reality. It is between the account of motion as a sequence of positions and the felt immediate reality of something actually moving. The arrow, as described in the paradox, is never moving. It is always only ever in a place. And yet the experience of watching it fly is the experience of something doing what the description says is impossible. The paradox does not resolve itself. It rests in the gap between the measured and the moving, and the gap does not close simply by insisting that it should. Both paradoxes share the same logical structure, the structure that Zeno brought to every argument he made. Begin with an assumption that the ordinary view requires that motion is real, that plurality is real, that the world of distinct things moving through space and time is the world as it actually is. Follow the assumption through its own implications, carefully, without supplementing it with anything it does not already contain. Arrive at contradiction, not an inconvenient result, not a result that requires modification, but a genuine contradiction, a place where the assumption requires two things that cannot both be true at once. The motion of the arrow requires that it is both moving and not moving at every instant. The race of Achilles requires that the infinite is both completable and not completable in the same run. The contradiction does not say anything about what the world is. It says that the view assumed at the start cannot carry its own weight. It asks, without answering, what a view that could carry its own weight might look like. Parmenides had already answered that question in the way that a prior generation answers the questions that become explicit only later. Being is it is the one thing that can be thought and said without contradiction, the one thing that holds still under examination, the one thing whose acknowledgement requires no supplement and admits no gap. Where Zeno's paradoxes worked by following ordinary assumptions to their breaking point, Parmenides had worked the other way, beginning from what must be the case and deriving, step by necessary step, the character of what is genuinely real. The two approaches arrive at the same country from opposite directions. Zeno shows that the world as assumed does not cohere. Parmenides shows what a world that does cohere would have to be. What it would have to be is still. It would have to be undivided, not many things in relation to one another, but one presence, complete in every direction, without edges that open onto anything beyond it. It would have to be without beginning or end in time, because beginning would require a prior state of not being, and ending would require a subsequent one, and not being is precisely what cannot be reached or thought. It would have to be full, not a plenum in the physical sense only, but full in the sense that there is no region within it where something is absent, no gap where being gives way to non-being, and the coherence of the whole is interrupted. And it would have to be, above everything else, simply present, not moving toward its completion, not diminishing from a former fullness, not waiting for anything, not having arrived from anywhere, but simply and entirely what it is, in a way that time does not touch. Parmenides' image for this was the sphere, not a sphere one could hold or measure, not a geometric form in the mathematician's sense, but a shape used to express a kind of completeness that geometry can gesture toward, without quite reaching. A sphere has no preferred direction. There is no point on its surface that is closer to the center than any other point, no edge where the shape gives way to something less itself, no orientation that the sphere must be in for the sphere to be what it is. From every angle, from every approach, the sphere is equally the sphere, equally full, equally whole, equally present. Parmenides placed this image at the end of the argument for being not to describe a shape, but to offer the mind something to rest against. The argument has gone as far as the argument can go. What remains when all the implications have been traced and the conclusion set in place is this: being is like a well-rounded sphere, complete in every direction, holding nothing back, requiring nothing more. This is not a picture that anyone could actually see. The sphere Parmenides describes is not visible, not located in any particular place, not the kind of thing that could be pointed at or approached or walked around. It is what remains when all the distinctions that ordinary experience relies on, here and there, now and then, this thing and that thing, have been traced back to their logical foundations and found to rest on something that does not itself have those distinctions. The sphere is not an object, it is the shape of what it is to be, without qualification. To hold this image in mind, not to analyze it, not to test its philosophical implications, but simply to hold it, is to do something that the mind does not usually do with philosophical arguments. Usually an argument asks the mind to follow it, to track its steps, to keep the earlier premises available, while the later conclusions are being drawn. The sphere asks for something different. It asks for rest. It is an image whose philosophical meaning and whose contemplative effect are not separate things. The wholeness that it describes is also a kind of wholeness that the mind can settle into, not by grasping anything, but by releasing the activity of grasping and allowing what the argument has been pointing at to be, for this moment, simply present. There is a tradition, not philosophical in the technical sense, but touching the same country, in which awareness itself is described as having this character. Not the awareness of this or that particular thing, not consciousness directed toward an object, but awareness as such, the openness in which all objects and all experiences appear without the openness itself being an object or an experience. Several ancient Indian philosophical schools and certain later Buddhist traditions spent as much care on this question as the Eletics spent on being, and what they arrived at was strikingly close to what Parmenides had found by a different path. Awareness, they said, is unchanging, not stable in the sense of a thing that holds its shape through time, but unchanged in a deeper sense, unaffected by what arises within it, untouched by what passes through it, the same before and after anything that happens within its field. The sounds that arise in it do not mark it. The thoughts that move through it leave no trace. What appears in it does not change what it is, because what it is not a thing that can be changed. It is the prior openness in which change occurs, and the prior openness does not change, even as it accommodates everything that does. Parmenides had not arrived at this from meditation or contemplative practice, as far as anyone knows. He arrived at it from an argument, from a sustained act of purely rational inquiry into what could coherently be said about the nature of what is. That two such different kinds of inquiry, the logical and the contemplative, should find their way to the same description, is something worth resting in without needing to explain it. The agreement may mean that both are tracking something real. It may mean that at a certain depth of inquiry, the questions begin to converge, regardless of where they start. It may mean something else entirely. What can be said is that the stillness Parmenides described in the language of logic is recognizable to traditions that described it in the language of awareness, and that the description, from both directions, is of something that does not need to arrive because it has always already been present. The water at the bottom of a deep well has this quality, not the water as a physical object, not the water considered as a collection of molecules in a particular chemical relation, but the water as an image, the water as a way of pointing. At the bottom of a well, undisturbed by what moves at the surface, untouched by the weather or the seasons or the activity of any life above the rim, the water holds its depth in the dark. It is not waiting. It is not becoming. It is simply at the depth it is at, holding the stillness it holds, indifferent in the most complete sense to whatever is happening above it. If something were lowered into it, the water would accommodate the intrusion. It would move aside. It would close again. It would return to what it was, as though nothing had disturbed it. Not because it recovers, not because it works to restore itself, but because the disturbance was never, in the way that mattered most, a disturbance to what the water essentially is. It was a surface event. The depth remained. Zeno's paradoxes point towards something like this, when they are followed all the way through. The arrow that is never moving at any instant, and yet traces its arc across the sky. The race that cannot logically be finished, and yet finishes every time it is run. These are not errors in the fabric of experience. They are indications that the fabric is resting on something that the fabric's own categories cannot fully describe. The motion is real in the way that motion is real. The paradox is real in the way that the paradox is real. And underneath both of them, patient and untroubled, is something that neither the motion nor the paradox touches, something that was already there before the arrow was drawn back and the bowstring released, something that will be there after the arrow lands and the flight is remembered as having occurred. What the arrow was doing at every instant of its flight was occupying a place in the wholeness of being, not moving through it, not disturbing it, not creating or destroying any part of it, simply occupying, at each position, the fullness that was already fully present at that position. The stillness underneath the arrow's flight is not the stillness of the arrow not moving. It is the stillness of everything that is real, holding still in the way that what is real always holds still, not because it cannot move, but because it has nowhere it needs to go. Achilles runs, and the ground does not run. The argument proceeds, and the silence in which the argument proceeds does not proceed. The paradox unfolds, and what the paradox is unfolding within does not unfold. There is always this asymmetry between the thing that moves and the space in which it moves, between the thought that travels and the awareness in which it travels, between the argument that reaches a conclusion and the stillness that was present before the argument began and remains present when the argument has finished. Parmenides had traced one side of this asymmetry, the side of what does not move, what does not begin, what does not divide. Zeno had traced the other side, the side of the ordinary world, looking for the motion it was certain of, and finding at each step that the certainty did not quite hold. Together they drew the shape of a difference that the mind can rest in rather than resolve. The ordinary world does not disappear in the Eleatic picture. The fire is still fire. The night is still night. Things move and change and appear and cease to appear, and nothing in the philosophical argument asks anyone to pretend otherwise, or to regard their immediate experience as something other than what it is. What changes is not the content of experience, but the hold that content has, the grip that the ordinary world exercises on the attention, the sense of urgency that the flux of appearances generates, the pressure to keep tracking what is changing, because what is changing is what matters most. In the Eleatic light, That pressure eases, not because the changes stop, but because something is visible underneath them that does not change and never needed to, something that was already complete before any change began, something that will be no less complete when all the changes that are happening now have found their way to wherever changes go. The Stoics, who came later and thought differently about almost everything, nonetheless kept something of this in their practice of the evening review, the quiet accounting at the end of a day in which what had been done was set down and what remained constant underneath the doing was allowed to reassert its presence. The day had been full of motion and decision and the small urgencies of a life, and then the day ended, and the stillness that had been present through all of it came forward again, not as a new arrival, but as a recognition of what had never left. The Stoics would not have described it in Parmenidean terms, but the practice of returning to stillness, of allowing the day's events to settle back into the quiet ground from which they had emerged, has something of aleia in it, something of the philosophical conviction that what is most real is also most calm. Parmenides had by the time he was old given most of a life to a single question. The question was not whether things change. That much was evident. The question was what remains when change has been traced back to its logical foundations, when the coming to be and the passing away that ordinary experience takes for granted have been examined carefully, when the claim that something has ceased to exist has been followed to wherever it leads. What he found was that the following leads at every step to something that does not cease. The argument that should have been able to reach non-being kept arriving instead at being, at the presence that cannot be escaped, the fullness that cannot be subtracted from, the wholeness that cannot be interrupted, because interruption would require a gap, and a gap would be non-being, and non-being is precisely what the argument could not reach. This is not a comfortable conclusion in the ordinary sense. It does not resolve the immediate concerns of any particular life. It does not tell anyone what to do with an afternoon, or how to bear a loss, or what to make of the slow unraveling of things that once seemed permanent. Parmenides was not offering consolation. He was offering something more permanent than consolation, an account of what permanence is and where to find it, which is not somewhere other than here, but underneath here, at the depth that is always present and always holding. Zeno, carrying his scroll through Athens, was carrying the other half of the same gift. The paradoxes do not resolve. The arrow remains, in a precise logical sense, always at rest. The race remains, in a precise logical sense, always still in progress. The ordinary world examined carefully does not close into the neat package that common sense assumes it is, and this is not a problem to be solved or an error to be corrected. It is an opening, a place where the ordinary view becomes transparent and something behind it becomes briefly visible. The way glass becomes transparent when the light outside falls in a particular way and the glass stops being a surface and becomes a window. What is visible through that window is hard to name. Parmenides named it being. The contemplative traditions named it awareness or presence or the ground of consciousness. The mystics of several different lineages named it differently still and disagreed about its nature and its implications, and the disagreements were genuine and in some cases still unresolved. What they shared was the direction of their looking, inward and downward, toward what does not move, toward what has no need to arrive, because it has never been absent, toward what holds still at the depth where depth runs out, and there is simply the fact of what is, undivided, complete, resting in nothing, because there is nothing for it to rest in that is not already itself. A stone in a river holds this quality in its way. The river moves around it and over it, and the stone remains, not fighting the current, not asserting itself against the movement of the water, simply occupying the place it occupies with the whole weight of what it is. The water does not trouble the stone. The stone does not need the water to stop. The movement and the stillness coexist without conflict, each fully what it is, neither diminished by the presence of the other. This is not an argument. It is an image of what the argument has been pointing at, the stillness that does not require the motion to cease, the depth that does not require the surface to stop moving, the ground that holds everything without being disturbed by any of it. Parmenides' argument, followed all the way to its conclusion, does not ask anyone to stop perceiving the world as it appears. It asks something more modest and more thoroughgoing than that. It asks the attention to locate itself, not in the flux of appearances, not in the urgency of what is coming or going, but in the stillness that is present underneath all of it, that was present before any particular thing arose to disturb it, that will be present after the disturbance has passed. The location is not a place. It cannot be traveled to. It is not reached by doing anything or stopping anything or achieving any particular state of mind. It is, in the Parmenidean account, simply what is, always already the case, always already here, in the same way that being is always already present, not because it arrives, but because it cannot be absent. Zeno's Achilles never quite reaches the tortoise in the logic of the argument, and the race is run and won in the world. Both are true in their different registers. The logic does not invalidate the running does not dissolve the logic. They coexist, the way the surface of the water and the depth of the water coexist, different things at different depths, each fully real in its own way, neither requiring the other to stop being what it is. When the arrow is in flight, it is at rest at every instant, and the flight is real, and the arc is real, and the sound it makes when it lands is real. The paradox is not a reason to doubt the flight. It is a reason to wonder what else is real alongside the flight, what holds still while the flight occurs, what was there before the bowstring was drawn, what will be there in the quiet after the sound of landing has faded. The answer for Parmenides was always the same. It was the only answer the argument could reach, the only answer that did not contradict itself when followed all the way to its foundations. Being is not was, not will be, is in the present that has no before and no after, the present that is not a point on a timeline, but the only time there is, always already full, always already whole, holding everything that appears within it, without being changed by any of it. The evening settles into its own depth.